Yes, please.
The question is to Mr. Bernardo. You spoke about La Défense in France, in Paris. There is a good segregation of the People's Plaza on top and transport system below. I couldn't quite get you. Do you say that it was wrongly done and now we need to correct it? Because one of the statements said now back to the ground, and one of the proposals. So what was it exactly?
Yes, in fact, the fact that the car was given the ground plane, it allowed it to be in the space where man belongs. By being pushed, man was pushed away, not the car. The car took over the ground plane. And even when we think of the separation of car and pedestrian, there is something strange about even arriving to a place by car or any other means and not having contact with the ground plane. You were, in the case of La Défense, in fact, compared to the space available in that huge esplanade that is dead with, as you saw in the picture, no trees, nothing. People don't really use it. They go to the edges, like in a regular street, because human nature is to be closer to the buildings and be protected from the wind and the expanse that exists in that space. If you look at, and I want to clarify, I don't think it's a question of separation of car and pedestrian. In the examples that we saw in San Francisco and in Boston, the reverse was done, and the car was elevated, but it still created that darkness and that barrier. There's nothing wrong with the eye contact between car and pedestrian. That is what Champs-Élysées are, what all the streets of Paris are. In fact, that separation is problematic. It is what makes it not natural. There have been many examples of failed locations of parts of cities where the street was closed down, cars were not able to arrive, and the street died by pedestrianizing it 100%. We're not advocating that there's never a car, because you need a street. You need the street to begin with for the ambulance to make it, and for buses or light rail to make it, and for the firemen to make it. I mean, you still need the streets. But I think that the separation is what makes it not natural and human. We heard from my colleagues here that part of sustainability is also longevity of the city and making it therefore a pleasant place where to live. And so I don't think, I think what we're not advocating here is that total division of the space. It can be shared and make it back to a real street.
Earlier, the spines of cities used to be waterways, which have kind of now been blocked with urban development. So when you are talking about rejuvenating certain areas of cities, can't we look at even these aspects, where we are talking about removing all these blockages in cities which have developed over the years? And sustainability also is going to impact, all these things are also going to impact sustainability.
Okay, well, I think you're totally right, because, if, for instance, you look at like some cities that used to not have any flooding problem like in the past, and with all the infill of all the various waterways like in cities, and those cities now find themselves with massive problems in terms of flood control, whatever, I think that the restoration of the natural ecosystem that really is, was part of the foundation as to how our cities grew, I think is a critical element of making those cities more sustainable and more stable and more resilient to climate change. Because I think that it's very, very critical to really restore the quality system. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, in the natural landscape link that links Guangzhou together, I also showed briefly that the water system is tied into that system. So the waterway and the greenway are, coterminous. They work together, and it has not only an aesthetic but a specific hydraulic function, and an environmental function. So doing those things is extremely important, and we've been working, in fact, with the head of the hydrology department of the city of Guangzhou, and they have said that by doing that you actually improve the flow of the water through the city, and it actually helps the waters, the city breathe better in several ways, and helps with the water delivery issues as well, and the flooding control, so that it prevents a lot of that. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'd like to just mention it again, in the city of Bangkok, I was doing some work for the World Bank on Bangkok University. This is a long time ago, a real long time ago. I was just a young guy. But at that time, they had all of these natural waterways through Bangkok called klongs. And they were tree-lined, and they all got filled in, all of them, and trees cut down. And the temperature of Bangkok historically over that period of time from then to now has risen by 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So, Mumbai is a great place to reintroduce the natural elements and keep them very prominent, because they will influence the climate in a significant way. This is not trivial stuff. It has a very big effect for the comfort of people and the working of the city.
Jeff, a word of thought for you. This is Manish. I come from the project management fraternity. You spoke about, dense cities. I come from a city which is so power scarce. Gurgaon, the Millennium City in India, gets power for 8 to 9 hours only. Don't you think while we make cities more denser, it'll make it even worse in situations which are, we are talking about developing countries, developing cities, very less infrastructure development from the government, public-private ownership. How do we answer that question?
Well, let me tackle one quick thing on it, which is that smart growth is smart growth, and it works in smaller cities as well as bigger ones, which is that you link the center of these places, whatever the scale, through public transit rather than, the use of cars. And then you link the places together through rail lines and other public transit, and so that people walk to the transit systems or take bikes or whatever, and they don't get in their cars. And so it doesn't matter about the scale. But the other thing is you have to, as a practical matter, you have to look at the reality of the world and the populations. And infill development is much more important than sprawl. The ideas of cities spreading out and eating up the landscape is a much worse effect than properly densifying the major cities.
I think maybe there's a question of a definition of density here, because maybe you may be thinking in terms of density in the horizontal sense, in which very little is left in terms of open space. But modern technology has allowed us to vertically stack spaces instead of going horizontally, and the opportunity that verticality gives us is precisely to create a proper balance between open space and built space, and be able to achieve densities without sacrificing green space, without sacrificing contact with the ground, without and be able to, by the fact that there's density, be able to mix uses, because retail can survive if there's enough density on the ground floors. If you have low density, as in the first image as I showed you, there's no way that can happen. It has to be concentrated every so many 2 miles, every 3 miles, and you have to drive to it. So, but your question of, your concern about density may be resolved by smart planning, and you can accomplish high density and get all the good aspects of quality of life that you're hoping for.
Yeah, and one thing that I would like to add, because like of the experience that we I've been having both in China and in India, which we've been involved, like quite extensively now. The pace of change here is so fast that in a way, like density and new development happens like at a pace where the infrastructure don't come on time, basically. And I think that then the density then is often perceived by most people here and in China as well as creating a sense of making cities not as livable as they were before. When in fact, if the infrastructure, like transportation, is a major one, obviously, but also like good transportation planning as how the roadway system work, public transportation, if all these things and open space were all planned accordingly as when the project goes forward, I think the perception, the negative perception of density would be very different. And it's one of those things where, like in a way I think that the recession, like in Asia, which slowed a little bit like the growth, I think was a good opportunity for people to really, like step back and evaluate a bit what has been going on for the last 20 years and be, like critical of what was, like good projects and what was not so good in terms of development. And India, I think, like, is at this critical kind of juncture, where the growth is starting to happen very, very fast. And I think that one needs to develop the tools to be able to assess these projects and make sure that the impact that these projects create on the environment, either the transportation, open space, whatever, are somewhat dealt with, so that density is not negatively perceived, I think. But it's needed. I think there's no choice about it.
Yeah, we have time just for one more question. Please, go ahead.
So this is quite a bit out of track so far as planning architect is concerned. But when it's a question of developing cities within cities, say for example, the first speaker gave the example of New York City. When we are redeveloping part of existing city where the people are already staying, so in that case, how come the people, the occupant and the owner, if the land was owned by the local state government, or if there are various owners, how they were persuaded, because that is what is the principal problem so far as Mumbai city is concerned, to persuade the people to be ready for redevelopment of that particular part. How people were successful in all those cities, Shanghai and New York, etc. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, well, of course, the examples that I used were not inhabited neighborhoods. When there were rail yards, the case of the Pudong was an agricultural, the other side of the river, which was disconnected. There were no bridges, and that was not part of the city. It was an agricultural land. And in other cases, like the Hudson Yards or Bubni, there were the rail yards. And in the case in Abu Dhabi, it was a palace and palace grounds. And what you are referring to is mostly maybe more related to the situation in La Défense, where there's actually workers' housing, almost like below Industrial Revolution level, as you saw from the picture, for a developed country. But what the government did in that case is that they created such an increased new value by creation of the new city in La Défense, that with that, the government made the initial investment to move these people to better housing and to decent housing, and which more than compensated for the value created by the creation of the new La Défense district. It was, literally the housing there was like barracks, and it was, or worse. And I presume that maybe the parallel that you try to make with Mumbai, that there may be no rail yards, there may not be any decommissioned industries that have moved out. There may not be an empty space where to build a whole new city within the city, but there may be neighborhoods that are underutilized in terms of the density that I described. Maybe they're like 1-story or 2-story, horizontal, solid, no green space. And how can that be dealt with? And I understand it's a political problem. It is a practical problem on how to deal with that, and it requires a significant investment, because it means that housing has to be built first for those people to move before they can be displaced. Now, the practice that I'm describing happens every day in China. Now, of course, the Chinese government is something else in the sense of the authority that it yields in the nation. But constantly obsolete neighborhoods are relocated in China to create new cities within cities. This is a fairly common practice, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
It is over there, and it's a way of improving the standard of living of those who were living in substandard neighborhoods. It is it's an investment that the government makes in improving the quality of life of its people and lifting the economy and making more livable cities and more sustainable cities. I mean, that is a long-term investment that the government chooses to make, and that would have to be made. And I realize that it is not an easy choice, and that it is a difficult one. It's not just covering some railroads, obviously.
One last question.
There's a human aspect to it that is really important and is tough to deal with.
Okay, one last question, please.
An architect from Mumbai. What would you put as the years that it would take for a sustainable city to again undergo development in the future? Like every 75 years or 100 years, we are going to rip apart the cities, and again we are going to talk about the same things, that these were mistakes made in the past, so we are coming up with something new. Okay, now we are talking about sustainable cities, but we are not talking about sustainable architecture. We stop talking about sustainable architecture with heritage structure. We don't destroy them. So that's been there since centuries. But the new architecture, the new materials that come, they deteriorate over time, the architecture becomes obsolete. So it's a big problem. I don't know whether anybody is looking at it. It's just an open question.
You know, the cities have been reinventing themselves for hundreds and even thousands of years. Rome is a city that when you visit it, you can see the early Rome, which is about 30 feet below the present day Rome. It just kept and keeps going up like that. It's remarkable. And you know, I think Mumbai can reinvent itself significantly in a decade as a starting principle. But the way to do it is to deal with the most obvious issues first, which is getting around the city and organizing, you know, patterns of preservation and patterns of development within that plan. So it's a top-down policy level. And I mentioned very briefly that the most important thing about what happens in the work we're doing in China, and I think Bernardo just mentioned it in a way also, is how the policy comes from the top, is where the destiny of the city goes. That is the single most important thing that has to happen, is an enlightened policy and desire to move ahead in an intelligent way and really tackle the difficult citywide issues. And from that, all of the things you raise and other people have raised can get successfully solved.
I want to add, however, that one has to always think long term, and nothing that is done in a hurry works. And it is, and much of what we see, we talk positively about the transit system in London or the street arrangement and green spaces in Paris, happened over several hundred years. It was not done, and it was done by people who were being very thoughtful and careful and were thinking way long term. In fact, the boulevards of Paris tear down entire pieces of the city, and it took a long time for those street edges to be defined, for those trees to grow to the size in which they are today. It was, and the amazing subway of London happened over a long period of time as well. It is, I think these are, and when you think of how long it's taken to do the Docklands, I mean, it's been several decades already since the planning. So quick solutions are I mean, and often in politics, people want to see things immediately to say that they're the ones who cut the ribbon. It's very difficult to propose a plan that somebody will get the glory for, many other governments later, So it takes a lot of courage in the world of politics to plan for others to inaugurate. The reality is that long-term thinking is the essence of this, and for some time, you're only going to see partial solutions, and it's sort of irritating that it's partial, that it's not complete, but you live with the vision and the hope that things will come together later.
Yeah, and one thing that is interesting is that, like Mumbai, like currently, is actually very sustainable. In a sense that there was a McKinsey report, I think that was published like 2 or 3 years ago, that showed that like currently over 88% of Mumbai like residents use public transit, which is more than any city I've ever been to, which is phenomenal. The public transit system is like exploding because like it's stretched to its limit, so it needs to be expanded. But what's interesting is that what's critical is that the public infrastructure improvements that needs to occur, because the city is like bursting at the seam, are so important to happen in a very methodical and very organized way, so that people don't feel that the only viable option they have as soon as they have a bit of money is to buy a car, because even when you assume that only 12% of Mumbai residents drive cars, see the state of the streets now, it's incredible. And the issue with the city, because it kind of stopped investing in public infrastructure at some point in time, some of the data that was coming out of the report, for instance, were very interesting. It showed, for instance, that the amount of land devoted to transportation, to roads, in Mumbai, was, and I forget the number, it was something like 8 or 9% of the land mass, as opposed to, for instance, New York, which is something like 25%, or London. So what happened is that the city grew incredibly fast, in fact, and a lot of my friends and clients in Mumbai tells me of how Mumbai was only 20 years ago versus where it is today. It's it's a totally different story. So it's almost like if it grew incredibly fast and the infrastructure has not kept up. And I think that what's critical now is to have really methodical, very logical planning for the infrastructure. And as Bernardo said, because we live in a democracy here and people have vision up to the next election cycle, it's hard to have these grand public projects that needs to take place, basically. So in a way, I think it has to come, from, it has to come from the population. It has to be something that people are very aware of, and it becomes an issue that is always, being discussed and is at the forefront, of the political discourse. And it needs to come from very high up to the Prime Minister, who, as I quoted, my presentation, Mumbai cannot fail, cannot fall into, into a failed city. So I think that the issues are very critical. I think it's infrastructure. It just grew so fast that basically, it couldn't keep up. The same is true with open space. If you see the amount of open space that the city offers, public open space versus other cities, it's really lacking open space. So these are issues I think that needs to be taking place of, and hopefully has to be coming from the public sector, who then can enforce it basically. So.